So guys, as I say, welcome. Thanks very much for joining today, and thanks very much for completing the poll. As I say, it just helps us understand who the audience are. So the webinar today is all about how to carry out an environmental review. It is a shorter one of the webinars, and I would say that it is, if you like, the first stage of dealing with your aspects and impacts. We won't be going into actually how to complete the aspects and impacts register today and how to do the risk assessment side of it. So today is all about the event that happens prior to that, assessing your environmental performance and doing your environmental review. So a little bit about my background. I've been with Citation now for just over 12 months. I've been working in the ISO 14001 environmental field now since 1999, 2000. Grew up in a family who were involved in landfill. So I come very much from an environmental background and spent every school holidays on a landfill site. And then for my sins, decided to do it for a living. So I've been dealing with ISO 14001, as I say, for well over 20 years now. And I also get involved quite heavily in other ISOs, more recently, especially the ISO 27001. But my core original was definitely from the ISO 14001. So before we go through everything, just a couple of admin things to consider. At the end of the session, there will be a time for general questions. If you've got anything very specific that, if you like, is specific to your organization or something that you don't want to say out aloud in public, you can contact me. My email address is pinned to the chat. So feel free to put any general questions that you've got in chat. And if you've got anything specific, feel free to drop me an email and I'll gladly come back with some tailored response specifically to your question. The main question that we get is, can we have a copy of the slides? And the slides will come out to you over the next 24 to 48 hours. They will actually come to you as an email with a link where you'll be able to get a recording of today's webinar, as well as actually a copy of the slides. So we do get a few people emailing in saying they haven't received it. So just look out for your email, because it does actually come to you as a link rather than actually as a presentation. So now that we've got out of the way, let's get going. So what are we going to be looking at today? We're going to be looking very much at the basics. So what is an environmental review? What are the benefits to conducting an environmental review? What should, or maybe what shouldn't it cover? And kind of techniques, different ways of doing it, we'll have a look at. And then we'll have a look at some actual specific scenarios where we've put together some ideas for construction, for office, and for factory floor. Now, as I say, that might not be relevant to everybody's business, but most people do have some form of office function. Some of the stuff that's within the factory floor will be replicatable in many industries, and similarly with construction. But if there isn't any examples that we run through today and you are struggling with things, as I say, feel free to drop me an email and I'll be able to give you some tailored advice for just yourselves. So what is an environmental review? An environmental review is essentially looking at your current environmental performance. So how you as an organization are currently performing, how are you affecting the environment? And it's important to consider that it's not just how you're currently affecting the environment, but it's how you have a potential to affect the environment. So some of the things you might want to consider when you're conducting your environmental review is use of raw materials, whether that's actually in something that you manufacture or whether that's something that you use for packaging. Your energy usage and where that energy comes from. What waste you produce and how much and what you do with it. Your water usage, something that a lot of people forget when they're first starting out with their environmental review, but water usage is actually quite a big thing. Emissions to air, again, a lot of people sit there and say, well, we don't have a chimney, therefore we don't have any emissions to air, but you'll be surprised as we start looking through, there are quite a few things that we have to consider. You've got discharge into waterways, so that's where you might have surface water runoff that's going into a river, or it could be that you've actually got a discharge consent. Discharge onto land. We'll also be looking at, within an environmental review, ways of improving your performance. And importantly, your compliance with environmental legislation. So it's an overall review of exactly how your environmental performance is, how you're affecting the environment currently, and how you have a potential to affect the environment. There is no real science behind an environmental review. It's very similar to something that you may have done before. You may have done, for example, a health and safety review, or Or you may have done a financial review where you've gone out, you've had a look at everything that you're spending money on and trying to understand how that can affect you at the moment and how it could be improved. With a health and safety review, you go around and look at everything that you do as an organisation that could affect health and safety, and again understand how severe that is, and then look at ways of improving it. Well, an environmental review is no different. Let's have a look at what we're doing as an organisation that affects the environment, and let's have an understanding of potential effects of the environment, and then start to think about ways we can improve it. So what should it cover? The first thing that I would say is it has to be relevant. So if you have a landfill site that's on the side of a river next to a large housing estate, then the environmental review is going to cover considerably more than if you're an accountant, sole trader working from a home office. So the first thing I would say to everybody is make it relevant. Focus all of your energy while you're doing the environmental review in where it can be most useful. So don't go, if you're a massive organization with 3,000 people in a manufacturing, the tiny little things you might want to just put to one side and concentrate on the bigger items initially. Whereas if you're a small organization, a lot of people sit there and say, I don't have any impact on the environment, but everybody has an impact on the environment. So focus the energy where it's important, make it relevant. So some of the things that you should be considering, what legislation applies to your business? When I work with clients, we regularly talk about what legislation applies to their business, especially from an environmental point of view. Most people are not aware of what legislation. So the first thing to understand is what is out there, what legislation applies to your business, and how well do you currently comply with it. From that, you've got changes to legislation, how they're going to impact you. One of the things that's changing legislation considerably at the moment is clean air zones. So depending on where you are in the country, depending on what kind of vehicles you may operate, there's changes in legislation that are going to have a significant effect on you. How your business uses raw materials and what it uses. So that's not just about how much it costs, but obviously that does have an effect. It's how much you use, it's where does it come from, it's what does it consist of. Could it maybe swapped for something that's less harmful to the environment? What kind of packaging you use? Is it necessary? Can it be replaced? Marks and Spencer's did a study years ago where they actually looked at their environmental review and they cut out all of their packaging to do with sandwiches. So their sandwiches that they now put in their fridges come on a plastic tray and they reuse that tray day after day after day instead of having lots and lots of cardboard boxes. So what kind of packaging does your organisation use? Do you even need the packaging? And if you do require it, how could that be considered to be replaced? And if it can't be replaced, how could you consider to deal with it either through recycled or safe disposal routes? How much waste do you produce? Again, if you're a manufacturing organisation, you'll be fully aware of waste during the stages of operation and how much that can cost, how much an organisation can lose, but also from an environmental point of view. If you're having wastage through your operation, then you're obviously using raw materials, you're using energy that could be improved. Come back to water. How much water do you use? How much does it cost? Things like toilet facilities. There are ways of improving toilet facilities so that small flush rather than a large flush and considerably reduce the amount of water that you use. What transport? What kind of vehicles, machinery? What kind of emissions do they give? A diesel-powered van from 25 years ago gives completely different emissions from a diesel vehicle today, which also gives completely different emissions to an electric vehicle of today. So understanding what you currently transport, what kind of equipment you've got, and what kind of emissions. So they're the kind of things that you're going to be looking at. That's the kind of thing that's going to be included within your environmental review. So what techniques can you use? Personally, I've put here some of the most popular. The first two have always been where I would start. So a site inspection or a walk-around survey is normally where I would start when I'm doing an environmental review. It's amazing how many things you spot when you walk around that you wouldn't have done if you sat in a boardroom. I've sat in boardrooms with many a group of directors or shareholders and asked them for their environmental aspects and how do they currently affect the environment. And they'll name 4 or 5. You walk around and you'll spot loads more. One of my favourite ones was an organisation I was working with. The directors used to have their cars washed every Friday, and a guy would turn up at the office and he would wash their cars in the car park. And all the pollutants that were coming off the vehicle were going straight into the drainage. That drainage was going straight to a small river, something that had never really been considered. You know, people wash their cars at home, therefore they didn't think it had any environmental effect. But as soon as it was in a commercial environment, and especially because it was going to a small river rather than going to the sewer, it had a significant effect. So have a walk around, start to look, start to speak to people. It's amazing how many people on the shop floor will spot things, will have noticed things, because they're looking at it all the time. Are machines being run when they don't need to be run? Are air compressors, you know, are they running 24/7 when they're actually only used during a short period of the day? So have a walk around, start to see the things that you can identify within the workplace. A survey of licenses and permits. We come back to the legislation. You know, what kind of licenses or permits does your organisation currently have? And then maybe do a cross survey against legislation. Have you got everything that you need? Do any of them come up for renewal in the near future? Another thing is a document review. So a very long-winded way of saying, just check your utility bills. Start to have a look. You know, has your electric usage gone up considerably in the last 6 months or 12 months? Are there ways that you could reduce that electric or gas usage, your utilities? And life cycle assessments, and we'll look at them specifically now. So what is a life cycle assessment? A life cycle assessment is essentially looking at the entire life of the product. So instead of just looking at, for example, how you might use it, think about it in the entire life of it. So a perfect example of this is potentially something like an electric vehicle. So you might turn around and say, oh, we're moving away from a diesel vehicle and we're moving to an electric vehicle because it doesn't give out any emissions. What life cycle talks about is understanding the bigger picture. So how were the batteries generated? How were they made and manufactured? How was the vehicle shipped to you in the UK? How are the batteries going to be disposed of afterwards? So you don't only have to consider the exact moment in time when you're using the item, consider the life cycle. And when you look at ISO 14001, it talks about thinking of the items that you have an ability to affect. So think of the aspects, the environmental aspects that you have an ability to affect. But in reality, you have the ability to affect the majority of things because you can vote with your feet. You know, if you've got two energy providers and one provides 100% recycled electric or green energy, and another one that provides, you know, from coal-fired and gas-fired power stations, you might want to consider who you buy your utilities off. If there are two organisations who can do deliveries for you, but one of them is using brand new vehicles that are all got the latest technology on to try and reduce the environmental pollution, and the other one is using 25-year-old vans that are giving out lots of really harmful pollution. So you do have the ability to affect. You can't go to that supplier and say, I want you to buy new vehicles. But what you can do is you can move your contract to someone who is using clean energy. So don't only think very narrow-minded, think the big picture. So on the slide there, you'll see we've talked about what raw materials were needed to make that product, what other resources were required, what waste is produced, etc. Another good example for that is things like packaging. So certain packaging, you might be able to buy it slightly cheaper if you're buying it from the Far East, let's say. But when you consider how long it's taken to get to you, how much energy has been involved in getting it there, if there's a local supplier who can do you very good quality recycled packaging and it's only a very small amount difference in price, you might want to consider that. So start to think about the whole life of everything. So when you've identified the aspect, whether that's transport, whether that's utilities, whether that's packaging, think about the cradle to grave, as we call it, right the way through. How has that item affected the environment? And consider after you've finished with it. So consider how is it going to be disposed of afterwards as well. So now we'll have a look at a few scenarios. As I say, we've got three different ones. And as I said at the start, if there is anything that isn't specific, if there is anything that you're struggling with, feel free to reach out and I'll be able to go through your individual case with you. So first of all, let's have a look at construction. So if you're in the construction industry, whether you're a house builder, whether you build roads, whether you do sewers, any form of construction industry, what kind of things might you be considering within your environmental review? Well, you need to consider where your raw materials are coming from. Are they local? Was that delivered 2-3 miles from down the road? Or did it come on an overnight shipment from 250 miles away? I mentioned it before, but what kind of vehicles are they using? If they're shipping from long distances, are they grouping loads? Are they trying to reduce their environmental footprint? Have the organisations that you're dealing with got ISO 14001? Are they working towards environmental improvement as well? So what type of materials are you using? Are they sustainable? So are the items that have been from a sustainable source? Wood is especially one that's talked about now in the construction industry. Where does the wood come from? Is it from a sustainable source? An area where there's a lot of environmental pollution on construction sites is how is the site lit? I totally understand that there has to be, from a health and safety point of view, good lighting on site. You don't want people to get injured. But how many times have we drove down the motorway and there is 5 and 6 miles of cones, and in the winter after 3 o'clock they're all floodlit, and there's nobody there because they all finished at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or whatever. So start to think about how is the site lit? Could that be improved? Could we use solar energy banks that charge up through the day and then give out light in the evening? Could we move to LED lights that use a significantly less amount of energy than the old style lights? And do we need them lit all the time? Could we put motion sensors on them so that we only light the parts of the site that need to be lit when people are there? How is heating and accommodation provided, and what is the energy usage there? So regularly on construction sites, you'll see things like porta cabins. Regularly, porta cabins are not the best insulated, so there can be quite a lot of heating that's just left blaring constantly. So trying to understand what kind of heating and accommodation is provided, what's the energy usage, and is it right? Is it fit for purpose, or could it be improved? What vehicles and machinery are used, how are they fueled, and what are their emissions? As I said before, age of things, have they been maintained correctly? Have they had their filters changed? Are they being used in the correct manner? All of these things can have a big significant change to the emissions. The energy usage of tools, so things like battery power tools, mains power tools, what kind of energy is being used, how are those batteries being charged, etc. And how is waste produced on site? Obviously there's legislation in place now for large construction sites to be able to segregate waste and recycle it. But I suppose the best thing to look at is not just about recycling the waste, it's about reducing it. It's about making it so it never became waste in the first place. So could you be smarter with ordering? Could you speak to the suppliers and actually get packs in a different size that might be more suitable for you so that you can reduce the amount of waste produced on site? So that's the kind of things that I would be looking for if I was a construction site and if I was undertaking my environmental review. As I say, depending on the size of the organisation, focus on the things that are important. On a construction site, we're not going to be particularly looking at how many milliwatts does a laptop particularly used by one of the engineers, because we've got bigger items to consider right now. But if you were a single sole trader, then that probably would be fair. So the second example we'll look at is an office environment. So if you're in an office environment, a lot of people will regularly say to me, oh, we don't have any environmental issues because we're just a small office. Some people now, especially over the last few years with the changes, a lot of people are working from home offices. But again, whether you're working from home or whether you're working from a commercial office or whether you're working from a shared office, there has to be aspects that are occurring. So some of them you may be able to totally control because you're in control of them, or you might be third-party aspects. So if you're in a shared office, then it's things like the energy usage within the collective office. So things to consider here: printers, lights, computers, how many of them are switched on when they don't need to be? If it is your dedicated office, you could start to look at things like utility bills. with lights, you could start to consider things like motion sensors, timers, printers and computers. Do printers turn off at night? Are they on a timer plug? How many printers sit on for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, when there's only people in the office for 8 to 9 hours a day? So could you consider putting a timer plug in? Water coolers. Water coolers have been a massive thing for years, and we've seen these trucks driving around delivering the 25-litre or 30-litre water bottles that sit on top of them. So when you start to think about your environmental review, could we swap our water cooler for one that's plumbed in, that doesn't need somebody to drive every week and deliver these large plastic bottles? Do we have plastic cups? Could we change the plastic cups and consider cardboard or paper versions? Or even better, give people water flasks that they can refill themselves. Ink cartridges, how many are used and how are they recycled? I think that's becoming less and less of an item these days because more and more people are working away from printing things. Paper, similarly, how much is used? Is there a paper policy? Is the paper recycled? So where do you buy your paper from? Do you just buy the cheapest room possible, or do you spend a couple of pennies more and get it from a recyclable source? A lot of people in larger offices now will have printers that only print once you go to the printer. How many times have we printed a document and as soon as we press print, we realize we've made a mistake on it? So we update the document and we press print again. But do we go to the printer and cancel the first one so that we don't end up with 50 pages of rubbish that we didn't need? So a lot of people in larger offices now have what will be like key fob release. So you press print, but it doesn't actually come out of the printer until you get there, and then you press your fob on it, or you put your code in, and then it releases it. Are there food recycling bins? Are there any recycling bins? Food recycling especially, if you look at the other recycled streams, by the time you get the food out of the general waste, within many offices, the stuff that's left is quite good dry recyclables that can be recycled. Coffee and tea, is it in sachets? Is it not? Again, it comes down to relevance. That landfill site that I mentioned that's got 50, 60 people working on it, and it's got 20 or 30 huge excavators, they're not going to be doing an environmental review considering the tea and the coffee. But if you're a single sole trader working from home, then it might be something that you need to consider. A kettle or hot boiling water. We've all been to the offices where they've got a permanent Burco strapped to the wall that's boiling 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's got 3 litres. Yes, it does save you a few seconds when you want your cup of coffee, but it's unbelievably inefficient to have water boiling permanently when there's nobody there for 16 hours of the day. Air conditioning, how much does it cost? A few years back, people didn't really care too much about the cost because energy was relatively cheap. The way that has spiked considerably over the last few years, air conditioning, how much are you using it? If you go on holiday, you'll normally find that if you sit in your apartment with your air conditioning running and you open the window or you open the patio door, the air conditioning will go off. It will have a sensor on it. So could that benefit your organisation? Could you put sensors on the windows? Because we've all walked into offices where on a hot day, half of the office open the window and the other half turn the air conditioning as low as it can possibly go. And I don't know about you, but I've never seen an air conditioner that can actually cool down outside. And by opening the window, that's all you're asking it to do. So could you consider that? And what are your heating bills like? And where does the energy come from? So there's some of the areas that I would be looking for personally if I was conducting the review of an office environment. And the last one we're going to look at is a factory. So we've called it the factory floor, but as I say, there's many different workshop environments, factories, manufacturing organizations where this is going to be very relevant. Very much thinking about the life cycle of the product here. The machinery again, how much power does it use? What does it cost? Lighting and heating is very similar to the way it was within an office, but normally in a factory or a workshop environment, it's just significantly bigger. So how are you heating it? How are you lighting the area? Again, have you considered motion sensors? Some factories, some workshops will be using the great big blowers that have gas tanks behind them. You know, have you considered infrared? Have you considered infrared heaters that actually heat the people rather than just heating all the space around them? Where do the materials come from? Are they recyclable, especially with packaging? How much waste is created? if you can save a small amount of waste during your manufacturing process or during your construction process, that's something that you didn't need to buy in the first place. It's something you don't have to pay to get rid of in the end as waste. It's also something that you're not expecting people to work with. So it serves many purposes to reduce the waste, not only from a cost of buying an item, but actually through the full life cycle. Are materials toxic? There's lots of things when we go and do environmental reviews and when we do health and safety reviews, people will have often a cosh cabinet, and you open up a cosh cabinet and there's everything in there. Some of them quite toxic. So are there alternatives? One I've seen many times in my career is label remover. People will want label remover to take it off items. There was two different types of label remover I used to use regularly. One of them was significantly toxic and one of them was perfectly harmful. Both did the job, both cost the same amount of money. So therefore, why don't you use the ones that are better for the environment? How much water is being used? Coming back to liquids, is there a risk of spillage? So this is where I said it's not just about how we're currently affecting the environment, it's about how we have the potential to affect the environment. So if you're in a factory and you've got a forklift truck and you put it on charge overnight, do you put it next to the grid? So if it leaks all its oil overnight, if it has a hydraulic hose that bursts, does all the hydraulic oil go straight into the water stream? Have you considered that kind of thing? Have you got a spill kit ready so that in the event that it does have a hydraulic hose burst or it drops some diesel on the floor, how are you going to clean it up? What are you going to do with it? What are the emissions and what kind of transport? So they're the kind of things, again, if I was given the task of going into a factory and starting to consider an environmental review, they're the kind of items that I would be looking for. So other things that we can do moving forward, as I say, this was a short webinar to be able to demonstrate to you the first part of the process, getting out there, doing a review, identifying what your current aspects are, what your potential aspects are, and really doing that brainstorming exercise. The next stage of the process, which we'll cover in another webinar in the near future, is going to be about how to document that, how to put that into an aspects and impacts register. But one of the things that I wanted to just run through with you is a new service that we offer called ISO Mentor. These are training courses. They are done online, but they're not pre-recorded content. So they are one-to-one live. You do have the ability to interact with the trainer, and they take you through step-by-step everything that you need to do within your organization from an ISO point of view. So not just conducting an environmental review or dealing with your aspects and impacts register, but everything from senior management. What is senior management's responsibilities with an ISO? What are the different risks and opportunities? How do you deal with your awareness and communication? And there's a whole host of training courses that have been put together. It's a cracking little system. I actually was involved and speak quite a lot with the team that run that in putting those presentations together. So if any of you are interested in having a look at it, understanding what's involved and costs, there is an email within the chat for ISO Mentor, or you can drop me a message personally and I'll run through with you what my thoughts are and what I see as benefits specifically to you once I understand the size of your organization. Some of the things there that you'll be able to read about the benefits of the Mentor package. As I say, the big thing is the fact that it's live. It gives you the ability to ask questions. And it's also the fact that the training courses repeat. So if you did a training course today and you spent an hour, let's say doing a training course, and afterwards you said, I've learned a lot, but I wouldn't mind doing that one again, you can pick it back up and do the whole course again, whether that's in a week or whatever, next time it runs. So there's lots of different things there as benefits. Also, when you get a copy of this presentation, you'll see 3 different links there. One is to learn more about the ISO system. One is to download the most common non-conformances. We audit and we construct management systems for ISO 14001 every day. I've been doing it for a number of years now, and there are many, many things that we see time and time again as the main non-conformances. So there's a link there that'll be able to take you through them. And there's also a link to Atlas. Atlas is our platform that allows you to manage your ISO system whether that's with documentation, whether that's with templates, whether that's with task management. It encapsulates everything for you there. So as I say, feel free to drop a line, whether that's to the sales team that you'll see there, whether that's to the marketing team that's put today's presentation together, whether that's directly to myself or whether that's to the ISO Mentor team. There's lots of different options for you there. Feel free to reach out at any point. And what we'll do now is run through any questions. Do you have any websites that can recommend for keeping up to date with environmental legislation? Hi, Nigel. If I had £1 for every time someone's asked me this, I could probably build you a lovely website. The reality is it's very difficult for me to give advice without knowing your individual organisation. If you are, for example, a waste operator, let's say you're a skip company, then the ideal location would just be the Environment Agency. If you were something very specific, if you were manufacturing, constructing and transporting lithium-ion batteries around the world, then you would need to look somewhere completely different. The one thing that I would say is don't think that just about paid resources. There are lots of websites out there that you can pay a fee to, and they will actually then deal with all of your environmental legislation and send you the details. Before you start to consider those kind of things, have a look at what free resources are out there. There is quite a few. The Environment Agency is a really good starting point. The Environment Agency do a monthly, I think it is, mail shot where they send an email out that talks about any environmental legislation that's changing. You also get to see them prior to them changing. You can also get involved in understanding what's being talked about prior to legislation going live. So my initial answer would be try the Environment Agency. And then if there is anything specific, depending on your industry, feel free to drop me a message and I'll be able to come back with anything that's more specific just for you. What approach would you recommend for companies that are not based on site? What about working from home schemes? Would you expect? Would you, excluding this from the scope? Hi, Maria. I wouldn't look to exclude it from the scope. If you're looking at ISO 14001, you are specifically looking at your environmental performance, your environmental management. If you don't do an environmental review to understand how you're affecting the environment, then fundamentally everything else falls apart. So if you don't understand how you affect the environment, you have no way at all of managing that, complying with it. So in essence, you lose everything. So I definitely wouldn't exclude it from scope. How would I approach it? Again, depending on who you are, what you do. But some of the things that we talked about in office are also relevant if you're working from home. So, for example, as I talk to you today, I've got two 27-inch monitors in front of me. Those 27-inch monitors I purchased 3 months ago, and they're a category AAA, so they're unbelievably low usage of utilities. The ones that I had before were not. They were older technology. They were 3.5, 4 years old. They still worked, but the amount of energy usage through them was considerable. So start to think about things like that. So the actual, if you like, the things that you do personally affect. So your utilities, what do you do about visiting customers? Do you have any visits to customers? How do you get there? Do you drive? Do you go on the train? If you drive to customer sites, how frequently do you drive? Do you monitor how many miles you've driven? Do you monitor if there's different people within the organization, how many diesel miles have you driven? How many petrol miles have you driven? How many electrical miles have you driven? So it's quite surprising when you start to think right down to the granular detail. Working from home still has quite an effect, and it also has quite an indirect effect. So depending on what you're doing working from home, there is a likelihood that you are going to be dealing with other suppliers, and are you choosing the suppliers who are also thinking about their environmental performance? So I hope that's giving you a few little ideas, Maria. If you're struggling, as I say, ping me a quick message and I'll be able to probably come up with some more ideas once I know a bit more about your business. We moved to fully remote working last year. Can we, as an employer, have a scope based on that, and how who, following on from that, how do companies mitigate any issues when they only apply to employees' private residency without changing the employee? Hi, Nick. That's a long question that's got lots of caveats in it, I think, and one that could get me into a lot of trouble. Employee contracts, contractual relationships, we'll leave that alone for the time being. What I just mentioned about working from home, so there are things there that you can still look to do your environmental assessment on. If you've got lots of people working in home-based environments, then understanding what equipment they're currently using, understanding what kind of office facility they've got at their home. So as I mentioned a minute ago about screens, do they have the right kind of screens? Are they the best kind of screens? So if I was in your position, I would still be doing it as an employer. You can base your scope on that. There's no reason at all why you can't say that you work 100% remote. It does make things slightly more difficult. I'm not going to lie, because now you have to consider multiple personal residencies rather than just one. But when you actually start to think about the individual residences, you should be able to come up with a few things that I've mentioned from home working, and then think more globally as an organization. So not just about people working from home, but do you ever have travel? Do you ever go to customer sites? Do you ever use planes? Do you ever use trains? Have you got any company vehicles? What about your suppliers? What about any subcontractors who work for you? How are they dealing with their performance? So there is quite a lot of things that you can consider, even if you're a fully remote organization. And again, Nick, if you've got any specific query, drop me a message. I don't mind spending a few minutes catching up with you and running through a few things. What qualifications are available for people who run an ISO system? Hiya, Claire. There's a number of qualifications out there, depending on which ISOs you run. When you say run, I'm guessing you're in an organization and you're managing the system on a day-to-day basis. The first one that I would normally recommend to clients is that you do some form of internal audit training, so that you can get certified as an internal auditor. And then as your experience grows, start to consider doing a lead auditor. If there is anything training, whether that's at a foundation level because you're new to it, the mentor might be absolutely brilliant for you to be able to get a really good understanding of ISO before you start to move on to the formal qualifications. But mentor for foundation, internal auditor, and then lead auditor would be my recommendation. And if there's anything outside of that that you want to know, just get in touch. Hi, does some need to calculate the carbon footprint? Hi, Ed. The standard doesn't stipulate that you have to calculate your carbon footprint. However, it does talk about continual improvement. It does talk about monitoring and measuring, and it does talk about undertaking environmental assessments. So carbon footprint can be a really good monitoring and measuring tool, and it can be a benchmark that you then use for future continual improvement. So if you calculated your carbon footprint today, and then you did it every 12 months for the next 5 years, are you reducing it? The slight caveat I have is the way that carbon footprint can be calculated is very varied depending on which organization you use to be able to try and calculate your carbon footprint. Some people only think about their activities within their four walls, if you like. Some people consider transport to and from for their employees. Some people consider transport to and from for all of their supplies. So how you calculate your carbon footprint is really important. Excuse me. But I am a fan of calculating it and using it as a really good monitoring and measuring tool. You are then able to put some really good objectives and targets in place to be able to reduce it. Don't also think just about carbon footprint. I've worked in organizations where we've calculated the carbon footprint and the year after the carbon footprint had tripled. But we'd actually sixfold change the turnover of the business. So you might want to calculate your carbon footprint and then document it based on headcount, or you might want to base it on items of whatever item it is if you're manufacturing that you send out the door. So yeah, carbon footprint can be really useful. It's not a specific requirement, but personally, I'm a big fan of it. If you're dealing with waste transfer notes, would we need to take into account the waste transfer company's transportation? Hi, Jason. I would, if I was doing an environmental review, depending on your personal circumstances. So if I was a major landfill site and I was having 500 loads of waste delivered to me a day, I would probably be more interested in my operations on site when I did my environmental review than what kind of vehicles came and collected from me. If I was a firm of accountants working from a small office and I had my waste collected by somebody, then I would definitely be considering their transportation, because in relative to how, as an organisation, I'm affecting the environment, it's a significant portion of it. So yes, I would normally say take it into consideration unless you've got other things that completely outweigh it. And again, you don't always have the ability. You can't phone up your waste provider and say, we'd like you to buy a new skip truck because that one's old and it's polluting. But you do have the ability to swap waste providers to somebody who maybe does use biodiesel, to somebody who does buy newer fleet with the Euro 6 engines or whatever. So yeah, I would potentially consider it. At what intervals would you complete an environmental review? Annually can seem a bit excessive when there is little change regarding our services. Would it be sensible to review after a change in product business? Hi, Richard. Yes, it would be sensible. Again, it's about understanding what you did last time with your environmental review, what the outcome was. Have there been any major changes? Have there been changes not necessarily just to your performance, but also to things like legislation? So I would normally complete an annual review as a bare minimum. But that said, you know, if it was a small 2 or 3 people in an office environment and nothing was changing, I would probably complete one really in-depth environmental review, and then probably just a desktop review of that document, maybe the next 2 years. And then on the 3rd year, I would go back into the start and actually complete a from scratch environmental review and get right down to the nitty gritty. So it's all about what's right for you as a business. If there's no changes to your products, your business, your people, the laws, I wouldn't want you to waste time doing the document again. I would want you to devote your time and energies to start thinking about the next stage. How can we improve that environmental performance? And if you bolt on the second part of it, which we'll cover in the next webinar, if you start to think about how are we trying to put things better, what objectives are we setting, how are we going to monitor and measure after we've identified all these things in our review, the chances are you're going to have to do some form of review anyway, just to see how that's going, to see how your performance is improving. But I wouldn't want you to just waste time doing something for no reason. You mentioned about internal audit. Is there any courses you would recommend if your company is looking to carry out this in-house? I would, Jason. If you send me an email, I'll be able to go through with you what we can offer. We do have specific internal audit training courses that we can do them specifically for you as an organisation, or we also do public courses, and internal auditing is also included within the mentor package. So reach out after this webinar, Jason. We can have a quick catch up. I'll let you know what we're able to offer. And then if it's right for you, I can put you in touch with the right people. I think that's the end of all of the questions. Just want to say thank you very much for everybody. It's the first time that we've done a webinar on a Monday. It's been amazing to see how many of you have been able to join us today. I know that Monday can be quite hectic at work. I hope you all got something from it. There's contacts there in the chat, whether that's for Mentor, whether that's for marketing, or whether that's for myself. Feel free to reach out to any of us. And I look forward to catching up with many of you guys on the next webinar.